My name is Michael Lee. I'm a judge at the Federal Court of Australia, but more importantly, for present purposes, I also have the high honour and distinction of being a director of the Whitlam Institute. In that capacity, we now move to session 2, which involves the launch of the legacy paper on the joint sitting, and this session is described as This Historic Occasion, the Joint Sitting of 1974. It was an occasion, and now we have our second program of film highlights focusing on various aspects of the debate.
Pursuant to the rules adopted by both Houses, the joint sitting will now proceed to the appointment of a chairman. Is there a proposal?
Mr. Clerk, I propose to the joint sitting for their chairman, the honourable member for Sydney, Mr. Cope.
Mr. Cope, do you accept nomination?
Yes, Mr. Clerk.
We should get on with the business, and I welcome you to the chair.
I'm sure, Mr. Snedden, that if everybody feels as relaxed as I am, we'll get on famously.
It is the first time that the proceedings of Parliament of either House have been televised to the nation. I welcome the opportunity thus provided for the Australian people to see the workings of their Parliament at close hand.
There's a story I was reminded of this morning by my colleague, Mr. Wentworth, the honourable member for McKellar, about the Parliament of Russia. The Parliament of Russia were discussing the colour that the Russian clergy should wear while Lenin was taking over the country. Now, that in many ways, Mr. Chairman, is the point here.
It was not the Duma or Parliament of Russia which debated the colour of clergy robes during the revolution. It was the Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church.
A further attempt was made in the past few days in the High Court to prevent the enactment of these bills, along with the other 5 bills, into law. That attempt to stop the proceedings that are taking place here in Parliament today, I am pleased to report, has failed.
Here, with this historic double dissolution meeting, 3 matters deal with electoral issues.
We can have more distractions if the members might like to speak to them. I'm dealing with a bill.
Now, the honourable senator from Queensland who's interjecting, I congratulate him upon his interjection. We all congratulate him upon his interjection. It's the most sustained display of activity we've seen from him since he came here.
I'm grateful to the last speaker, Mr. Killen, who, no matter how abhorrent his politics, never manages to be dull.
This is the 4th time that this so-called Labor health scheme has been debated in this place, and it's the 4th time that I stand here with the unanimous support of everyone sitting on my left to oppose it with all our force.
When the spokesman for the opposition on matters such as this, the member for Hotham, Mr. Donchip, said he was prepared to go and even fall at the barricades fighting against the proposal for a universal health insurance program. Well, with the kindliest intent in the world, I say to him that as one of the first casualties to fall at the barricades today, he can be one of the first people to call on the benefits of the new universal health insurance program.
Having once pushed the Australian government to an election by double dissolution, the opposition has immediately threatened to repeat its behaviour. It is a supreme example of little Australians, narrow and biased in their approach, exhibiting uncompromising opposition to the legitimate Australian government.
Expired
Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition, a personal explanation. The Right Honourable Gentleman claimed to have been misrepresented.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Chairman, on the same matter, I seek leave.
The Honourable Prime Minister claimed to have been misrepresented.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Honourable Prime Minister.
So, I would like to raise one other point of order with you.
Understanding Rule 14, I move dissent from your ruling.
There has been some virtue in these too long and sort of interminable days of debate, because senators have had an opportunity to see their colleagues at work in this chamber. And you perhaps have had a chance to see some of us more closely than you otherwise do.
May I suggest something that I think should be said? It's a pity, Mr. Chairman, that this joint sitting doesn't take place more often.
I wish to thank members of the Senate and members of the House of Representatives for their cooperation in the orderly conduct of the business of this historic meeting of both Houses of the Parliament. I wish also to record appreciation of the contribution made towards the smooth working of the meetings of the party leaders by the party leaders and the parliamentary officers in both Houses.
Now we move to the launch of our second legacy paper. So I'm going to invite Professor Frank Bongiorno and Dr. Joshua Black to come and address us in relation to the matters canvassed at greater length in their paper. They both have a long association with the Institute, certainly a long one in the case of Frank, who of course is a distinguished fellow of the Whitlam Institute, and Dr. Joshua Black is our Pallas Letters Fellow. So please welcome them.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'd like to add our acknowledgement to those that have already been offered, to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and extend our respect to elders past and present. I'd also, of course, like to thank the Whitlam Institute and to greet members of the board and members of the Whitlam family. It was a great privilege to be commissioned to write this paper, and a great joy, I have to say, to work with Josh on it. I'd also, I guess these sorts of words have already been said, but I'd also like to pay our respects to the staff of the National Archives of Australia who performed absolutely heroic feats to make the footage of the joint sitting available to us. I think we're very privileged to have been able to see that material here, and you know, what a great legacy that is going to be of the activities of the Whitlam Institute this year, in partnership, of course, with the archives. We've already heard quite a bit this morning about the events that led to that historic, as it was often called, occasion, or as the Leader of the Opposition, Billy Snedden, put it, historical occasion, in August 1974. This afternoon we're going to hear more about the policy issues that were involved in the joint sitting and the double dissolution election that preceded it. And rather than, I guess, steal anyone's thunder in relation to those things, what we're going to do here is discuss the staging and performance and rhetoric and reception of the joint sitting. So we'll deal with it almost like a pair of, I don't know, anthropologists or ethnographers or something, more than historians. So over to Josh, and we're going to sort of shift between the two of us.
Thank you very much, Frank. Nothing about the logistics and practicalities of that event was self-evident to anybody. There were no fewer than 36 issues identified by the officers of both Houses of Parliament that needed resolution before a joint sitting could be possible. There were very few international precedents on which to draw. The Leader of the House, the veteran Labor MP Fred Daly, quipped that with so few established rules to work with, it was just like a Surrey Hills pre-selection. Preparing for the joint sitting, to some extent, offered a momentary reprieve from the bitter partisanship of 1974. The government and the opposition agreed that the 6 bills, 3 dealing with electoral matters, 2 dealing with universal health insurance, and 1 to create a petroleum and minerals authority, would be dealt with in the course of 4 debates, and that each of those debates would span 4 hours. The Speaker of the House, the venerable and witty Jim Cope, who you've just met on the screen, would be elected chairman unopposed. Bills would be put up for affirmation or rejection without proceeding through the usual first, second and third reading stages. The seating arrangements would squeeze all 187 members of Parliament onto the green benches of this House, which normally accommodated 60 fewer bodies. There would be 4 cameras with which to capture that occasion and to create the audio-visual archive of great significance about which we've heard and some of the fruits of which we've now seen. Moreover, the sitting would be broadcast on the ABC television network, a highly novel experiment for the Australian Parliament. There were 3 slots for each day of the sitting, and MPs were required to speak from rostrums on either side of the chamber to signal a balanced presentation of the affirmative and negative arguments. Temporary lighting facilities were set up in the chamber, which prompted a couple of MPs to don sunglasses, and there was a broadcast van sitting on the Senate side of the building to help beam those signals across the country. The chamber resembled a movie studio as never before, although the television coverage was, as has been noted, still in black and white. Colour would not arrive until the following year. Now, Frank.
So the joint sitting made for an unusual television event. The party leaders of both houses, as we've heard, sat on either side of the table with the Deputy Prime Minister, as you probably will have already seen. Jim Cairns slouched across his seat. In addition to the 30-odd new MPs on the backbenches, there were 2 former Prime Ministers, John Gorton and William McMahon, who we've just seen. David McNicol, in the bulletin, thought, and I quote, "The members were buffed up to a degree I have not witnessed before, even at openings of Parliament." McNicol's vote as the best turned out man in the chamber was Fred Daly, whose discreet tie, good shirt and well-cut suit can be seen on this slide. In fact, you just saw it also in the video. So you can judge. I think we probably should have a vote, shouldn't we, later, who was the best turned out. The lists of speakers were carefully organised by government and opposition alike. I mean, David McKenzie, whose Diamond Valley electorate was particularly affected by the rapid population growth and infrequent redistribution, so it was very disadvantaged by the existing arrangements around that 20% variation. He spoke in support of one vote, one value quite early in the debate. Ministers and MPs who represented the ACT and the Northern Territory were allocated to the debate on proposed Senate representation for those territories. A combination of senior stars and rising talents argued the case for and against the Petroleum and Minerals Authority. The distinctive political swagger and biting turn of phrase were already in clear view in the case of 30-year-old Paul Keating, as well as the good suits. In fact, not unlike Mark's in some ways, but anyway. Paul's would probably have been more expensive, actually, Mark, I reckon. 3 of the 5 women who sat in the federal parliament were invited to speak on the health bills during the telecast slot, while the quirky and idiosyncratic former Liberal Health Minister Jim Forbes commended his Adwart leader for, and I quote, making sure that his contribution was not televised.
The television cameras did temporarily cool the atmosphere of this parliament. With his opening speech, Whitlam struck a deliberately sober and statesmanlike posture. His Labor colleagues invoked Enlightenment philosophers, modern American jurists and Australian government reports to bolster their arguments about electoral reform. Bill Hayden and Rex Connor were both remarkably measured despite the lengthy scare campaigns with which they had been faced in relation to both the Medibank and the PMA bills. Some commentators judged the South Australian Liberal movement Senator, Steele Hall, to be the star of the broadcast, redolent of an early Frank Capra film, although he appears at times in this footage as a little grand, perhaps even a touch sanctimonious, certainly no Jimmy Stewart. In their effort to make political capital out of the joint sitting, the opposition seized the occasion with both hands. At the outset, Snedden taunted the government with the prospect of another double dissolution election just 11 weeks after the last one. He described the special sitting as an anticlimax, And he punctuated all of his remarks with remarkable gesticulations and theatrics, some of which are captured here on the slide, I think. Coalition speakers described the electoral bills as Labor's attempt to secure itself in office through the creation of what it called a daily mander. In a sauntering presentation, the member for Kooyong, a younger Andrew Peacock, warned that if the government granted Senate representation to the mainland territories, it might allow one man on a Met station in the Coral Sea Islands to become his own senator as well. The Country Party MP Bruce Lloyd warned that Labor's health scheme would allow dictatorial power over religious care institutions and would force them to provide abortions. And there's a visible, audible ripple of anger through the chamber at that point in the footage. In their attacks on Connor's PMA bill, the opposition raised the spectre of covert nationalisation, bureaucracy, socialism, and an all-out assault on states' rights. It seemed a little like 1947 all over again, recalling an earlier campaign against bank nationalisation.
Thanks, Josh. Well, newspapers still played a pretty dominant role in the reporting of political news, and they gave the joint sitting a generous coverage, exploring the legislative substance of the event as well as the quirky human side. It has to be said they were competing with a lot of pretty big international news at the time. Watergate, of course, is reaching its climax at this time. Alan Fitzgerald noted that the bald head of Labor's Gil Duffy gleamed under the harsh lights, and a young Niki Savva, with us today, reported that it took 5 hours for the first member, Bill Wentworth, to nod off. More cynically, it was noticed that when telecasting ended, members who'd seemed alert and interested before suddenly found that they were wanted elsewhere, notably in the private members' bar. When Bill Wentworth moved to bring on a debate about inflation and industrial relations, as we just saw, Fred Daly suggested that the idiosyncratic member was posturing for the cameras and the strange people in his electorate who continued to return him. Commercial media companies exercised their right to use soundless video of the address of the debates, but they had to submit their scripts to the relevant parliamentary committee for vetting, lest the footage be used for improper purposes, such as satire. This caution may well have been justified if the quite rich cartoon output of the period is taken into account. It's hard to know how audiences responded to the television coverage of the sitting. It'd be fair to say that the general run of the Australian public's probably less engaged with politics than the people in this room today who are enjoying every moment of it. The Australian Broadcasting Control Board surveyed a sample of 146 Melbourne residents by telephone, not a very big sample it has to be said, in the days after the joint sitting. 50 respondents reported that they'd viewed part of the broadcast, while a further 50-odd said another member of their household had done so. The Sydney's Daily Telegraph hinted that viewers at home saw it as a great big yawn. Housewives were said to have preferred the soap operas and daytime movies. Some reported watching for a while and then switching over to something else because it was too boring. And one woman declared that number 96, the, of course, risque late-night soap, and I quote, was far too important to miss for a parliamentary debate on electoral boundaries. Certainly, unlike in this program, the joint sitting featured no nudity that we're aware of, although the Secretary of the Old Age and Invalid Pensioners Association, one Albert Thompson, suggested that MPs might consider appearing, and I quote, in the Altogether so their constituents can be more intimately acquainted with them. Armed with that newspaper, in advance of his own contribution, Jim Forbes nominated Lionel Murphy to lead by example in this respect.
The joint sitting had immediate effects on Australia's political affairs. Many years later, a much older Paul Keating reflected that the occasion had something of a salutary effect on Labor MPs, for whom the Constitution was seen to have worked. That seemed to matter, not least because until the 1970s, the Labor Party had often felt itself to be in conflict with the limitations of that document. The events of 1975, of course, would prevent a more complete reconciliation. In the longer term, the joint sitting led to a remarkable array of things: senators for the territories, one vote, one value, and regular redistributions of electorates, changes that strengthened democratic norms beyond the federal political sphere in Australia. It also established, as we've said, the forerunner of today's universal health insurance scheme. The Petroleum and Minerals Authority was less fortunate, falling down in the High Court on a Section 57 technicality.
So to finish up, I mean, with the joint sitting, the Whitlam government displayed its characteristic commitment to using the institutions of Australian democracy to the fullest extent to advance meaningful reform. For a brief moment, it was possible to imagine that joint sittings might even become a more common process of government in what, as we've heard Jenny quote, I think, the constitutional scholar Geoffrey Sawyer called government by double dissolution. Now, of course, that's never come to pass. Nonetheless, the historic occasion, as it was called, continued the adaptation of British traditions to Australian federal demands, and it gave flesh to the bones of a section of the Constitution whose day might yet arrive again. Thank you.
For that presentation, and thank you even more for the extraordinary paper, which I hope all of you will take the time to read. Niki, if you'd like to come here. I'm not doing a Jim Cope impersonation, I'm trying to do a John Faulkner impersonation. Now, there's one admonition to everyone involved in this session. I've been told that there is some difficulty hearing at the back, so if everyone can keep their voice up and everyone asking questions could keep their voice up, that would be wonderful. At the end of the day, this session... On the microphone, thank you, Mr Cavalier, you're out of order.
You said you weren't going to be Jim Cope.
The use of the word occasion in the title of this session is important. It was a singular and important parliamentary occasion. Apart from Niki and Paul Kelly, looking around the room, I'm not sure whether anyone else was here that day on that occasion. Would that be accurate? Was anyone else here? Oh, Malcolm McCarris.
Malcolm.
Is that Malcolm? Yes,
Yep.
Malcolm McCarris. Well, there you go, 3. So I'd like to turn immediately to Niki, who must have been about 12 when she
Roughly.
when she was here on behalf of the Australian, arriving, I think, that year to Canberra.
February
that year, in what everyone here would know was a great career to come. So, Niki, can you give us your impressions of the day and the personalities to start us off?
Sure. I just wrote a little something just to make sure I didn't forget what were the important things of that day, which have kind of become lost, I think, over time. First of all, I want to congratulate the Whitlam Institute for organising this event to remind us all of the momentous reforms enacted 50 years ago, which endure to this day. Those reforms, universal health care, one vote, one value, and providing Senate representation for the territories, improved the lives of millions of people and enhanced our democracy. People remember the chaos from those years, but forget that over these 2 days, and in the space of 3 years, Gough Whitlam changed almost every single corner of Australian life, mostly for the better, and against an obstructionist, vengeful opposition which never accepted the legitimacy of the government. Second, thank you for inviting me to participate, I think. It's exciting, but deeply unsettling for me to be sitting here exactly the same day, at the same time, as I was 50 years ago, only a few feet away, assigned as the youngest person in the office and probably the youngest person, I think, in the chamber at the time, to write a piece which captured the history of the moment. It wasn't easy. Although the outcome was not in doubt, the opposition had fought tooth and nail against all of the bills before, during and after the election. So there was a high level of tension in the chamber. It seemed like everyone was holding their breath. That is, until Jim Cope tripped when he was climbing into the chair. Everybody laughed and that kind of broke the ice a bit. Because it was being televised, most of the MPs were on their best behaviour to begin with, but that quickly ended. It was business as usual. I wrote at the time that it took 11 minutes for the first interjection, 26 minutes before Cope called for order, then soon after issued a warning. Liberal MP W.C. Wentworth was the first to fall asleep. He did that often in Parliament anyway, so it wasn't anything too new. On that first morning, I wrote that Steele Hall was the best speaker. I didn't find him pompous, really. Hall was elected to the Senate for the Liberal movement at the double dissolution election. He arrived in Canberra with an awesome reputation. He was someone who had sacrificed power for principle. By ending the gerrymander in South Australia, he ended his own premiership. His words carried weight because of the integrity that he carried, but he was deeply resented by the opposition. He responded to their taunts and interjections by accusing them of wanting to deny constitutional representative government in Australia and to set up a dictatorship in the House. Then opposition leader Billy Snedden began by complaining that they should be discussing inflation. It was actually running at 15% at the time, so it was pretty staggering. But anyway, and then he went on to draw comparisons with Russia. Looking back now, what also struck me is how much more important Parliament was. Every major media outlet, News Limited, Fairfax, the ABC, AAP, had rotating teams of reporters covering both chambers. I watched Whitlam announce the double dissolution of Parliament in this chamber around 8:30 on the night of April 10. He didn't have a press conference until the following day. He was a parliamentarian to the core. I just want to offer one small anecdote that kind of illustrates that. In the early 90s, Whitlam came to Old Parliament House for the opening of the restored ABC offices in the press gallery. They had a newsreel of historic moments, including Whitlam's speech on the front steps on November 11, 1975. It was running on a loop on a TV. He sat on a small bench and watched himself delivering his speech. I sat beside him on that bench and I watched him watching it, thinking all along, what could he possibly be thinking? When it was over, he turned to me and he said, "You know, that was the best speech I ever gave in this house, and it's not even in Hansard." I think that was an insight into the way that he thought about this place and about Parliament. Anyway, back to the joint sitting. I think it's a great shame its importance in historical terms and in the public consciousness has been overshadowed. In some respects, it was as if it never happened. Even the books written post-1975, chronicling the period, skim over the joint sitting. I think that's because of the number and the magnitude of the crises which subsequently enveloped the government almost daily, which I also witnessed and wrote about and remain etched in my brain. In fact, the seeds of those crises were sown at this time 50 years ago. There has not been another period like it. Nothing that has happened since in federal politics has even come close.
Niki, it must have been a very daunting thing as a young woman to come into this place, and particularly very early on in your journalistic career to be confronted with this highly unusual event. Can you give us some insight, if possible, into your initial impressions of the great characters of that time, leaving aside, apart from, you've already touched upon, obviously enough, the Prime Minister, but also some of the other great figures of the period. Who stood out as leaving the greatest impression on you as a young journalist?
At that time, well, I arrived here in February 1974, but of course I'd been following what was happening here, and one of the great figures in the government was Jim Cairns, because of the role that he took in the Vietnam War demonstrations. So I always thought he was a very principled and charismatic character, and reasonably attractive, I guess, for a much older man. So there was him, there was also Bill Hayden. I also remember the...
I was going to make an interjection there, but I decided that...
I know, well, I'm on the other, I'm on the other side of that now, I know that. But Bill Hayden, of course, he fought. So the AMA was the most militant union in the country at the time. And the level of resistance that there was to the introduction of the Universal Health Scheme was really something to behold. It was not only vicious in the media, but it was also vicious personally and physically violent. I remember there were instances where Hayden was being assaulted in airports. So it was a pretty dramatic time. And of course, you know, the most impressive figure for me was Gough. He was magnificent and majestic and, you know, visionary and all those kind of things. And he stood like a giant, I thought, in this chamber. He was flawed, of course, as most politicians are, I think, in one way or another, but there was no doubting that he had a magnificent vision for Australia, and some of which he got to implement, and unfortunately not all of it.
Thank you so much, Niki. Frank and Joshua, you have ploughed unyieldingly through seeing every moment of this footage. I must say, from my perspective, one of the more frightening aspects of this exercise is to realise how close it was to us losing this footage. The notion that it could have been forgotten and there would have been we could have unknowingly lost through deterioration of the record this remarkable footage that's been preserved is vaguely disturbing, and one hopes that other examples of historic footage in Australia's history is being adequately secured and preserved. But having gone through the process of reviewing this footage, I was interested in your impressions on the event as an occasion. What stood out for both of you as things that may have surprised you about the way in which persons related to each other during the course of the sitting, and what particular impressions did you take from viewing the whole of the footage?
Well, I can't claim to have viewed the whole. I viewed highlights, I think I'd say. I think, Josh, probably between the two of us, we've looked at everything, haven't we? What stands out? That it's a very human environment, one in which, and I suppose anyone who's witnessed Parliament knows this, but it's an environment in which there are a lot of casual, informal interactions that are happening alongside the more formal business. I mean, what I was struck by most of all, I think, in both viewing the footage, reading Hansard, looking at the commentary, is that in one sense, there's a kind of inevitability about it all. Everyone knew that the government had the numbers on all of the legislation, regardless of how the two independents voted. There was a flu going around at the times, and of course the Constitution requires an absolute majority, not a simple majority, so that could have affected the government. But in general, there was an acceptance that the legislation was going to be passed, which gave a slightly surreal atmosphere, I think, to the events. Perhaps a lack of what one might call drama, because there's not very much unpredictability, I think, about what happened, but there is a strong sense of a lot of eyes being on them. I think that I mean, obviously the use of that term historic occasion repeatedly is important. There was a sense that they were performing something that mattered historically. And I don't think, I mean, it was partly to do with the nature of the legislation, but it was much more to do with the ritual. It was to do with the fact they were engaged in a particular exercise that it had taken, 73 years, 73 years, not very good with sums, more than that, to happen. And that it was something that wasn't going to happen every day. They knew how winding the path to that joint sitting had been. So I guess, yeah, it's that strange dissonance in a way between the sense of this being important and historic and yet also kind of predetermined and inevitable. With one slight qualification, the High Court sitting over on the side, and it's no bit player in this. It had given the coalition in the hearing beforehand good reason to think that the PMA bill at least was going to be in trouble, and there could be other difficulties to do with having stored up multiple bills. So that is lending, I guess, a sense of the possibility of things coming unstuck, but certainly the actual parliamentary proceedings are sewn up in a lot of ways. I gathered that's what the sort of the laughter was probably about when the chairman was elected. I mean, it's all been sewn up. It's been agreed beforehand, and so I presume that the laughter was probably to do with that. Yeah.
I mean, I think the human point is a really important one. One of the things we do see in the footage is people kind of moving back and forth across the chamber to make the event continually move. So you'll see people like Fred Daly representing the government, Ian Sinclair representing the opposition, constantly going back and forth to discuss how the next piece of business will be handled, how the process of this novel occasion will take place. Everybody's going back into this corner where Steele Hall is sitting. There's footage of him next to or chatting with everyone throughout the occasion, because his vote is sort of one of the few that is genuinely up for grabs as far as matters other than electoral bills are concerned. I think that the footage also gives you a sense of depth to the occasion that Hansard can't. I mean, one really interesting exercise was to sit and read Hansard while the footage was playing and to sort of capture the bits that weren't in the written record. And there were really significant telling moments. During the first division, which I think was concerning one vote, one value, the chairman leans down from the chair and asks Norman, he's talking to one of the clerks, how do I cast my vote? Because unlike a normal sort of parliamentary procedure, his vote matters. Constitutionally, he is one of the total number of parliamentarians whose vote matters. So the footage kind of gives you this rich access to a much larger sense of the parliamentary process, partly on this novel occasion, but also more broadly. I think we'll come back to this footage in the future when we want to understand how this building worked, how Parliament, when it lived in this building, operated on a larger basis. So I think its usefulness, that footage, goes beyond just the joint sitting as well.
Niki, the fact that it was televised and the novelty of it being broadcast is something that's been mentioned a couple of times. Having had the opportunity of viewing the same parliamentarians going about their ordinary business in either the House of Representatives and the Senate and seeing them operate in the joint sitting, did you perceive as you were viewing it that the fact it was being broadcast changed the way in which people interrelated with one another, is the first question. And related to that, to the extent there was any difference, did that sort of dissipate as time went on?
No, I don't think it changed it at all. The reason why I was taking note of when the first person would fall asleep or when the first person would be warned was because I thought they're going to forget the cameras are there and they're just going to behave as they normally would. and that is what happened, really. You know, initially I think they were a bit taken by it, you know, the ties and the sunglasses and you know, sitting very properly. But then after a while it was just another parliamentary sitting day. And, I mean, everybody was in their corners as per usual. The government was still trying to get its legislation through. And even though the opposition knew that they had the numbers, they offered every possible resistance to it. So it was, in that sense, just another parliamentary sitting day.
All right, now I'd like now to move to a slightly different topic before we open up things for more general discussion. And I'd just like to touch upon, given what Paul Kelly said immediately before we had morning tea, two brief counterfactuals. On the 20th of December 1972, there was a party room vote for those defeated members of the government who had been returned for the leadership of the Liberal Party. There were 5 candidates for the leadership of the Liberal Party: the former Prime Minister, Mr Gorton, a future Prime Minister, Mr Fraser, Jim Killen, and the 2 people who ran off at the final ballot, being Billy Snedden and Sir Nigel Bowen. The final vote was 30 in favour of Billy Snedden and 29 in favour of Nigel Bowen. For those of you who don't know the name Nigel Bowen, it's a pity. He is a truly great Australian. He is responsible for really the development of administrative law in this country. He was a Minister for Foreign Affairs, he was an Attorney General, and he became the first Chief Justice of the Federal Court of Australia, where, as a very nervous young solicitor, I recall being sent up to do a bankruptcy case in front of him, and I was scared out of my mind. But he was very polite to me. It often occurs to me how different Australia would have been, the political history of Australia would have been, if it had been 30-29 rather than 29-30 against Nigel Bowen, because he was a man who would have stood up to people like Withers, and I think he is someone who would have never countenanced the blocking of supply. So on that analysis, there would have never been a 1974 election, whether or not he would have been able to withstand the level of obstruction that we've seen talked about today is another thing, but I certainly don't think he would have countenanced the blocking of supply. Before we go to the floor, I'd be curious to extend the discussion that was started just at the end of the last session about assuming that Nigel Bowen rather than Billy Seddon had been opposition leader and there was no 1974 election. What, as political historians, do you believe would have been the course of Australian political history during the latter part of the 70s, to the extent that you can speculate about it?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I don't know enough about Bowen's style and approach to be able to say he would have done things very differently. I mean, I would point out, I think, that and we talk about this in the paper actually, that there's also a broader global context of the world of 1973, 4, 5. I mean, it's the end of the long boom. It's a period of notable political instability, which takes a variety of forms in different places during this period. Sometimes it's a military coup, as in Portugal, which is sort of taking its course at the time of the 1974 election campaign, something that would have enormous consequences in due course for Australia, of course, with the East Timor issue. But, you know, it was the year of the 2 elections in the United Kingdom. It's the year of Watergate in the US. It's a period where dictatorship is bedding down in its brutal way in Chile. You know, perhaps rather paler in some ways, political crises that we see in Australia are a part of, I think, that broader scene. And so I think any government in this period was going to run into great partisanship, great obstruction, any reformist government of the Labor kind. I suppose that there are 2 kind of counterfactuals that people play with here, don't they? Yeah, there's no 1974 election and the government goes through and runs its course through to 1975. And I think, you know, I agree with what was said earlier. It would have had great difficulty in that economic environment of 1975 in securing re-election. The other counterfactual, of course, is the one where there's no dismissal, and it runs through to 1977, and probably with the same kind of result. I mean, we would have had perhaps an Australian scene that looks a little bit more like Britain in the 1970s with the Wilson and Callaghan governments. So, yeah, I'm not sure of how much emphasis to place on that leadership issue. You could be right that it would have been a different style of politics, but I do think that broader economic and political environment, the kind of winner-takes-all character that I think we find in a lot of politics in that period, not just in Australia, may well have kicked in. Yeah.
The other thing that was important at the time was the influence of the Country Party. And they had 3 exceptionally strong leaders, Doug Anthony, Ian Sinclair and Nixon, and they were effectively running the campaign against particularly the electoral reform bills. So I think whoever was leader at the time would have found it very difficult to resist that. There was also, including right up until November 11, very little opposition within the opposition parties to the blocking of supply. Very few of them were game enough to speak out until it was over, and a couple of them did then. So, and the power of the Country Party with Anthony and Nixon and Sinclair actually increased after Snedden with Fraser. So I think, I don't know Bowen, he might have been stronger, but I think he would have faced the political realities that he was dealing with inside his own party.
Can I put you on the spot more directly before I go to Joshua about, though, the comment that was made by Paul Kelly? Do you agree with his analysis that there was an inevitability about defeat of the government from the second half of 1974 onwards?
definitely. Not just because of the reasons that Paul gave about the economy and what was happening with the economy, but as I said before, the seeds of the crises which subsequently enveloped the government were sown from August 1974. That was when Jim Cairns met Junie Morosi at a party in Lionel Murphy's office, and they began going out to dinner, and by the end of that month he had offered her a job in his office. Now that, you know, you can say what you like, you shouldn't take any notice of the personal relationships of ministers and politicians and blah, 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 but the fact is everybody in this place knew that they had formed a relationship. She knew nothing whatsoever about politics. He was the treasurer. He had installed her in his office to run his office, and that split his office and isolated him from his colleagues. And that saga played through, not every day, but for very many days, for months. And the other thing that happened very close to that time was the signing of the executive minute to authorise the government to raise $4 billion for Rex Connor to enact his great dream of ownership of minerals and so forth. And then there was, you know, the whole loans affair and Lionel Murphy going to the High Court and so on and so on and so on. And regardless of whatever good things the Whitlam government did, they were all overshadowed by this constant sense of chaos and crisis. So, yeah, I think it probably would have still happened.
And Josh?
Well, just to round out the conversation about that counterfactual, I think to finish that counterfactual properly, we kind of have to imagine the walls of a chamber like this one as a little bit more porous than they look. So the pressure that builds up internally inside the Liberal Party or the coalition is one thing, but the pressure that's exerted on it in policy terms by groups like the Australian Medical Association, as we've heard, or the General Practitioners Association, particular figures in the minerals and energy sector. I mean, I think those sources of pressure are really important as well. And we see them having their effect on particularly moderate Liberal MPs, Don Chipp being, I think, a really powerful example. He begins his tenure as Shadow Minister for Social Security with a plea for moderation, a call for calm in the Medibank debate, and by the time we get to the joint sitting, it's a pretty unambiguous fight against universal health insurance. So I think those external pressures matter in the counterfactual of whether one leader may have been different from another in this context.
And before we go to questions, there's one aspect of your paper that I found fascinating, and that's when you went back to the convention debates as we saw the evolution of the creation of Section 57 and the terms, and it was a long process born out of in a particular historical context, including a Victorian political context where they've had great tension between the popularly elected Legislative Assembly and an appointed Legislative Council. It's always occurred to me that one of the interesting counterfactuals to consider is if the convention debates had happened slightly later. The worst Tory result in Britain was 2024, but the second worst Tory result was in 1906 with the huge Liberal landslide. You had Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, then you had Asquith coming in, you had the People's Budget in 1909, which led to the biggest political crisis in British history, which was the debate over the budget, which then saw the emasculation of power of the House of Lords because they did something which was perceived before then to be unthinkable, and that is essentially say they weren't going to pass the budget passed by the House of Commons. If one looks at the convention debates, you see this reflection, particularly by a number of delegates who said, we simply don't have to worry about the notion that someone would prevent supply. And in fact, a delegate from South Australia just said that would be a course that would lead to revolution. We don't need to worry about it. Now, if they had have seen, if it had happened 20 years later and they had have seen this occur in the United Kingdom, one thinks that they perhaps might have made explicit in the Constitution the notion that whatever powers the Senate had, they were restrained in their ability to block supply to the elected government, to make explicit what was thought to be implicit but unquestionable at the time of the convention debates. Do you have any comment about that?
Yeah, Michael. Well, Victorian constitutional history is at the absolute heart of all this. Victoria had had two great constitutional crises in the 19th century, in the 1860s and then again in the 1870s. It haunts the debate around deadlocks and double dissolutions and joint sittings. Graham Berry, who'd been the Victorian Premier during the second of those great crises, is there in the convention debate. So they have living, breathing historical testimony of the man who was at the centre of the second of those crises. And the Victorians in particular are insistent that there needs to be a workable provision. That's absolutely, it's rooted in colonial history. Yes, I mean, others have speculated, historians of Federation have speculated about what the Constitution might have looked like if it had come after the great, the budget crises in Britain of 1909 to 11. It became, I suppose, easier to imagine an upper house in a basically British community, as Australia was, shorn of some of those powers after 1911. Small states would always have driven a hard bargain, I think. It was always a condition of the less populous states participating in the Federation that they'd be protected. They were never going to sort of just roll over. But, the convention delegates do, the American emphases and American models are often emphasised, but they do have their eye on British bicameralism as well. And, I think that would probably have licensed perhaps a more permissive approach to dealing with upper house power, if this had all happened, say, in the 1910s rather than the 1890s. Yeah.
Do you agree?
I do, and I think one of the things that struck me going back to those 1890s debates and just looking at the Senate in the context in which it was created is its novelty as an extraordinarily democratic and powerful house. The chief difference with the United States Senate at that time, which, as Frank said, is often the model for understanding Australian bicameralism, is that it's not popularly elected. It's elected by the legislatures of the respective states. Britain's House of Lords still has hereditary peers. Canada's upper house is predominantly appointed, I think, and Australia has a kind of funky combination of the two. That is kind of elected on a restrictive franchise or entirely appointed. The kind of willingness to explore uncharted territory with the creation of the Senate as it exists in the Australian Constitution is, I think, quite powerfully operative on the story that we've told in the paper, and it's operative on the stories of 1975 as well. It's there in Kerr's jottings to the palace during the middle of the crisis. He reports on one of his conversations with Whitlam and says, I tried to remind him that he's not Herbert Asquith, he can't just stack the Senate. So that kind of alternative constitutional history is sort of sitting there at the back of these constitutional crises through both 1974 and 75.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's time that we passed it over to questions. So, can I see anyone's hand up? Yes. We'll just wait for the microphone.
It's a question firstly to Joshua. You mentioned the processes that had to be gone through to manage it. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about who was involved in that. The reason I'm raising the question also is we've just recently had a parliamentary leadership task force has handled the post-Jenkins material, and there's an argument to say that we actually need that sort of a leadership ongoing because the presiding officers don't have all that much power in the Australian Parliament. They tend to be people who didn't get to the ministry. And seeing whether there's some sort of mechanism of that sort which might give the legislature a bit more leadership over the executive.
That's really interesting. The responsibility for putting the joint sitting together as a practical exercise begins to some extent with public servants and the clerks of both houses. And I think one of the striking aspects of the archival material we were looking at in this paper was the degree of bitterness between those clerks, actually, the way in which they were willing to mobilise in support of their respective chambers, their respective houses, and the institutions that they felt they individually represented. And there are, really interesting letters back and forth that eventually they kind of decide there's a set of issues that we can't resolve. They have to be dealt with at the political level. And when you get to the point where all 6 of the bills have been rejected for the 3rd time by the Senate, the political leadership and the political will and decision-making comes into place. So it's an ad hoc committee. Fred Daly and Doug McClelland from the Labor side of the Senate represent the government. Ian Sinclair and I can't remember, one of his colleagues from the Senate represent the opposition. There's some independent representation, and the process is basically to sort of sit down in the cabinet room on the 30th of July and just nut out the details, the kind of the practical and logistical details that need political decision making. It's an ad hoc committee. It's kind of overseen at arm's length by Whitlam and by Snedden. And yeah, perhaps it is a really interesting model for parliamentary management and decision making in the long run.
Hello, my name's Jenny Lee, no relation. I'm interested in the point that my fellow Lee raised about, what if someone more committed to constitutional practice had been the leader of the Liberal Party? So my question is to all of you, but possibly most to Niki. Given that there'd been such a long period of Conservative government, did that sense of themselves being the rightful government, the natural government, so therefore it was illegitimate, these upstarts claimed it, and when you listen to the things that the tropes that Snedden was raising, my question is, you can't have democracy without people committed to the notion of the legitimacy of the people on the other side of the aisle. Is that sense of we will do anything to retain government still at the same level, do you think, 50 years on? Or is it now, after 1974, we haven't had such a long period of one government rule? Has the notion of a opposition that will stay within the safety guards of democracy, are we in a safer position than our cousins in the United States?
Niki.
Not necessarily. When you look at it, really, there is not much that has changed since 1974 and 1975. The only difference in a constitutional sense is that retiring senators or senators who die before their time expires need to be replaced by people of the same persuasion. So that would prevent, say, A. Joe Bielke-Peterson rigging the numbers in the Senate by appointing another Albert Field. But apart from that, sometimes when you look at where the coalition is heading, what direction it's going, it's difficult to see at what point they would draw the line and whether there is a line that they wouldn't cross. They might say they would not block supply, but in the first iteration leading up to 1974, all they said was, we will not pass supply unless you have a double dissolution election. And then subsequently it was, blocking supply until they forced the election. If we have a hung parliament after the next election and say it's Labor that's in minority, at what point would the opposition feel compelled to move to try to bring the government down and force an election? And if it could organise the numbers in the chambers to do that, then yes, I think it would. So I think we've had a reasonably stable period of government, but there's nothing to guarantee or give us confidence, really, that that is going to continue, given the methods that are being adopted and given the practices that are being adopted, which you can see quite clearly have been transported here from the United States, with the questioning of revered institutions. And I give one example here, and that was Peter Dutton during the Voice referendum last year, where he took issue with the AEC over whether ticks or crosses would be accepted. And at the time, Dutton accused the AEC of manipulating the vote or trying to skew the vote. Now that led to a whole lot of death threats against the AEC and threats of abuse and violence and so forth. And sometimes I wonder, what if the vote had gone the other way? What if it had been 40-60 in favour? All the people who had been perhaps riled up by Dutton might have felt moved not to accept the vote. So I think there are certain dangers at the moment, and we all need to be more vigilant.
Now, I'm not going to touch this with the pub poll, but did one of other of you, Frank or Josh, wish to make a comment about that?
Well, I suppose that it's the issue of the dismissal. I've often thought about, could it, I mean, some people say, it couldn't happen again, impossible. The circumstances of 1974-75 were so unique that, it just no opposition would go down that path, and I've never believed it. I think it's utterly contingent on circumstance, and I've never doubted for a moment that in the right circumstances, that where there was sufficient advantage to be gained, that an opposition could block supply again.
There's nothing to stop them.
There's nothing to stop them. I mean, nothing's changed in terms of the constitutional situation, so yeah, the rules are the same.
I wanted to take up, thank you. I wanted to take up your issue on the politics about Snedden and Nigel Bowen, which is a pretty difficult issue to come to grips with, but also support a couple of things Niki said. I guess I don't see how Nigel Bowen as a leader would have been able to resist the titanic political forces being unleashed on the coalition side in 1973 and 1974. We start with the autonomy of the Senate leadership, Reg Withers and Greenwood. Now, they run their own operation here. Snedden has very limited control over them, and they start they essentially start within the opening months of the Whitlam government. They are rejecting all sorts of procedures and motions in the Senate. By the end of 73, Withers and Greenwood have formulated the motion that they will use in late 75 to terminate the Whitlam government. That is, you don't reject the supply of the budget, you move an amendment. They've got this sorted out well before Christmas 73. So they are running an extremely aggressive campaign of obstruction from the Senate, and they've got the capacity and they've got the power and they've got the influence to do it. Now, when it comes to the Gare affair, Graham Freudenberg recalls a discussion he has with Snedden later on, and Snedden, who was very keen to call it on, of course, blamed Anthony. And he said, well, Anthony was hot to trot. He was making it virtually impossible for me. Well, the point about that, of course, was the National Party was hot to trot. Anthony and Sinclair were determined to bring it on, and they were much more powerful personalities than Snedden. If my memory is correct, when the coalition parties in April 74 took the decision to call it on, to call the election on, there were only two dissenters, David Hamer and Jim Killen. Now, that just indicates the extent to which there was overwhelming support within the Liberal Party and the National Party for this technique, even though the technique was an extraordinary breach of constitutional tradition. Nonetheless, because of the political forces being unleashed, they were certainly prepared to do it.
Well, if that's right, and I'm sure the analysis is, then perhaps he might have gone off to be Chief Judge at Equity in 1973 if he had have been made leader, because he would have regarded his life as being dictated by others. Yes, did anyone want to comment on that? Niki, did you want to comment on that?
Absolutely agree with
Yes.
Paul that there was very little resistance within the coalition to the strategy that had been laid out by Withers, whose nickname was the Toe Cutter, for very good reason, and also the absolute determination of the National Party to make sure that none of this legislation ever got passed, and that they were hell-bent on destroying the government one way or another.
Yes, next.
Robin Archer, I'm from the London School of Economics. London School of Economics, Robin Archer. It's to do with the question before last, but it's looking at it in a slightly different way. I was thinking, what's the main thing I learnt from the previous session, and what's the main thing I learnt from this session? And one of the main things that came from the previous session was this sense that there was a fundamental illegitimacy conceded by the opposition, saw the government as illegitimate. And what did we learn from this session? Well, in a way, it's a little bit contrary to what's being said, but ultimately, the opposition sat down with the government, and the procedures of the government system worked, and both sides continued on with them. And then I was thinking, well, what can we learn about both of these things in the present, which is what the previous person was asking. And to me, it had a slightly different context, because in the present, though that illegitimacy is profoundly present in other English-speaking countries, it's not always the case that the institutions are being allowed to ultimately resolve it. So the Boris Johnson government is a good example of this, obviously, what happened with Trump and the election and so on. So I was wondering, what can we learn from this 74 experience? Not knowing about 75, but just from 74. What can we learn from 74 about what we need to do when there's profound illegitimacy in the political culture to keep things within the railway of the existing institutions?
Frank.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. There were some interesting distinctions being, Josh did some work on this, interesting distinctions being made in 74, and I think it was Greenwood, wasn't it, who pointed out that, Section 57 isn't really terribly ambiguous. It made it pretty clear that the government was entitled to a joint sitting. Now, yes, there were question marks about, which bills qualified and all the rest of it. But there was a perception on the Liberal side that they had a bit to lose by not playing the game. And you know, one of the things that's at stake in both 1974 and 75 is the relationship between, if you like, the black and white of the written constitution and the broader set of parliamentary conventions that sort of help to give that constitution life. And I think it's particularly the latter, as Paul just said, that were being breached in both years, both of these crises. So it seems to me there was always going to be strong pressure on the coalition parties to cooperate in relation to the joint sitting. They would be seen as bad sports. They'd be seen as potentially in breach of Section 57 of the Constitution if they didn't play along. But they're quite prepared to push and stretch and ultimately break those wider conventions of parliamentary government that go back in this country to the 1850s and, of course, in British systems even earlier. So I think that if we're thinking about legitimacy, it sort of has more than one side or more than one dimension in a system of this type. Yeah, I think that's how I'd respond, Robin. Yeah.
I mean, I'd add perhaps a couple of things. One being that television also conditions this. I mean, the opportunity to stand in the parliament and have it beamed across the country, to not take that opportunity, I think would have risked looking perhaps a little bit cowardly in terms of the opposition. Fred Daly on the Labor side was not taking for granted the sort of respect for the joint sitting as a constitutional mechanism. He was prepared for significant and robust obstruction on the path to the joint sitting, and of course behind all of these very calm, pleasant, polite conversations about standing orders and rules and who will be the chairman and which house, there is the High Court case determining whether or not it will even go ahead right up to the last day. But it is Ivor Greenwood on the coalition side who kind of is reminding his colleagues that they're not dealing, as you said, Frank, with a kind of convention. This is a really clear provision of the Constitution, and the language is one of responsibility, actually. It was quite sort of surprising and jarring to come across this in, the papers of coalition MPs held at the National Library of Australia in this case. But Greenwood is saying to his leader and to his colleagues, we actually have an obligation to help put this event together, or to at least bring this event to life. It's not a kind of assumed tradition or an unwritten practice. It's there in black and white.
If there had been true respect, though, this would not have been necessary at all. They would have just passed the legislation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of, I don't know if you came across anything on this, Josh. I mean, there is a kind of question of why they persisted after the double dissolution election when they knew they were going to lose, right? They knew that, okay, if this goes to a joint sitting, we're going to lose. Now, obviously, one aspect is the High Court, the series of High Court challenges that gave them a kind of a second option, I guess, for dealing with this. But I think there was also the issue of face. They, having, voted down this legislation on a couple of occasions already, they didn't want to be seen as simply waving it through.
Or to underline the point of the illegitimacy of the Whitlam government.
Yeah.
That, they had to make them fight for absolutely everything. They were going to give them nothing and concede nothing.
And which also gave them kudos with those interests, those types of interest groups that Josh was talking about, whether it's the AMA or mining interest in relation to PMA and so on. Yeah.
One of the things that we shouldn't lose sight of, it seems to me, in our discussion about what occurred in 1974 is, notwithstanding Cormac and Cope, notwithstanding the High Court decisions, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty at the margins about how Section 57 works. And for a determined opponent, there is some real unresolved issues which could be the subject of controversy. The next time, after 1975, that we had a Prime Minister calling a double dissolution election was, of course, 1983. And what occurred then was that Sir Ninian Stephen was waited upon by the Prime Minister as a party meeting is being held in Brisbane, which resulted in a change of leader. And, of course, he's sending away requiring advice about this issue of how long, which I think may have been unnecessary if you read the High Court case, but he was very concerned to get advice about the legitimacy of that double dissolution, and he wrote a letter which was, I think, tabled, which I have seen somewhere, about being satisfied on the basis of legal advice. One thing that concerns me about not having lawyers as Governor-General is there is real scope for mischief and ambiguity and very large legal questions, and difficult to know whether some of them are justiciable in relation to Prime Ministers coming along seeking double dissolution elections. In any event.
Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Street. This is a question for Niki. I'm wondering, after the bill's passed, in your conversations with any of the opposition MPs, was there ever a mea culpa that, you know, that wasn't that bad? And in particular, I'm thinking of the Medibank legislation, that, you know, we maybe on reflection got this one wrong?
Not that I recall. Not that I recall. And look, it happened, and then even at the time it was like, oh, well, it was just one of those things, and everybody moved on to something else. And as I say, there were so many other things that there were going on. I do recall distinctly after November 11, on the night of November 11, after we'd all adjourned to Charlie's restaurant in town at about 11 o'clock at night, there were two Liberal MPs who turned up. The place was full of journalists and Labor MPs, and they came over and said, we're really sorry, we never thought anything like this would happen. And I said, too late.
Geez, imagine being able to go to a Canberra restaurant at 11 o'clock at night now. That'd be amazing.
Well, this was how life was in this place. Parliament sat until 11, and there weren't all that many restaurants in town, and we all used to adjourn to a little house in Curry Street in Kingston, which was run by Richard Farmer, who was a well-known Labor figure, and his wife Jill was a cordon bleu chef. So there were, you got what you were given, you know, 6 courses, but everybody was there. Freudenberg was there, all the advisors were there, and you would stay literally until 5 or 6 in the morning, drinking and eating, and then sleep for a couple of hours and then come back. That was...
I think we've got time for one more question, and the chair of the Whitlam Institute has insisted upon him asking.
Thank you. Well, I'm encouraged to ask this question because of the comment made by our moderator, who a few moments ago indicated his concern if eminent members of the legal profession, he didn't say eminent, it's members of the legal profession, or his support for members of the legal profession being appointed as Australia's Governor-General. And I thought I might ask His Honour if he could understand why, after the appointment of Sir John Kerr as Australia's Governor-General, I don't share the same concerns.
Followed then by Sir Zelman Cowan, Sir Lillian Stevens, Sir William Dean. Yes. All right. Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that characteristically unhelpful intervention.
But it was quite interesting, though. I mean, there's a quote from the Palace Letters which we quote, where you know, Kerr is clearly unconvinced by the double dissolution, of the basis of the double dissolution. I mean, the whole tone of his, you know, the relevant letter to Charteris makes that clear. And he has a line in it which is something like, I did not think I should be my own lawyer or act as my own lawyer. It's kind of, I mean, it bears on the question you raised before, Michael, about those judgments around...
in that case, you had Sir Clary Harders, who was the Attorney General.
And Byers.
Morris Byers, Morris Byers and Harders. And of course, he ended up acting for Lionel Murphy. Had a great relationship with Lionel Murphy, acted for Lionel Murphy. He was actually probably the single man responsible for Lionel Murphy's acquittal, because he was the one that convinced him in the second trial to make a statement from the dock rather than giving evidence, interestingly. But the necessity to receive legal advice and be able to comprehend it when it comes to double dissolutions is something which is evident. And one looks at the approach Paul Hasluck took, which Jenny Hocking explains so compellingly in her paper. Anyway, it's a fascinating topic. I think now we've reached almost exactly the time when we were supposed to conclude. So if I could ask you all, it's been a very entertaining session, and if you could please thank our participants.